What made you realize that you're in a cult? Story 1. When my mom said a relative had educated himself right out of it, I realized that something you can educate yourself out of might not be the source of all truth and enlightenment after all. This is a big thing for Jehovah's Witnesses. They're encouraged not to engage in higher education because it destroys faith. Perhaps if learning to reason and understand science destroys their faith, that faith is not well founded. You don't need that much education, just some good reasoning. To wit, God. I am the only God. You can't even talk to the other gods. Other gods? Other gods? Wonder what they have to say. Other gods. I am the only God, or part of a team of gods, and we created everything, and you should only worship us. So wait, there are a bunch of gods, and they each claim to be the one true God, but one true God means there can't be any other gods, so which one is the one true God? Maybe I'm worshipping the wrong one. Or maybe there are no gods. By just thinking through some of this stuff, you arrive at 3 possibilities. 1, just accepting what your God says at face value, which is fine. 2, accepting that there are lots of gods and maybe you've thrown in with the wrong one, which is also fine. 3, accepting that there are no gods, which is also fine. Ultimately, it doesn't matter who's right because you have to die to be able to find out, so it's too late by then. Whatever floats your boat. Got the exact same BS about how too much education will turn you against God. This may just be an American thing though. I know at least 2 elders in my church who are PhD holders in worldly values fields, such as chemistry, English literature, or philosophy, and this is apparently par for the course in most other countries. We're Protestant, by the way. The American evangelicals seem to be the only ones actively fighting against education, for some reason. I've never been able to comprehend. It's because they push a high fundamentalist agenda that, among many other things, involves giving a ridiculous amount of money to the church. The church I went to taught tithing, but also always stressed that it was merely the minimum you could give to avoid being actively cursed by God. To be truly blessed, you should give 20% plus. If you came to the pastor for financial counseling to get out of debt, the first thing he'd tell you to do was start giving more. Give your way out of debt was a popular phrase. It only got more extreme from there, and abuse was very common and always buried. They rallied against the Catholic Church and the whole concept of priests while preaching that the pastor was the mouthpiece of God, and you should honor him in that way. They would entice kids to come to church with children's programs and toy giveaways, then force them to be baptized. My wake-up moment was when I was working in the line with the kids' baptistry. They forced all the kids to strip down in a changing room so that they could get robbed as quickly as possible. For some reason, one of the older men was nude there with them. Not to be baptized, just sitting there watching. I then saw a little Muslim boy I knew personally. I had invited him to church, running from one of the pastors naked, terrified they were going to force him to be baptized, because then Allah would curse him. In his mind, I don't know enough about Islam to know if that's true. They caught him and forced him to be baptized anyway, very roughly. Still have no idea what was going on with the naked man with the naked boys to this day. Story 2. I was raised in the family radio apocalyptic Christian cult. I guess the biggest oh crap moment was when the world didn't end on May 21st, 2011. My whole life was building up to that day and I had no other purpose. And then May 22nd came and I figured out how to live in a world that I was taught to reject. Ah yes, a month before I graduated, I remember reading an article about an open atheist who offered a lot of people who believed they would be saved a contract. This contract basically stated that since your pets will not be joining you in heaven, you give me $1,000 to take care of your pets in the event that you are indeed taken to heaven. Food, shelter, etc. He got several dozen, if not more people to actually go through with it. The rapture came and it went. These people are obviously upset and probably very irritated that they are out of $1,000. That was their fault though. They signed a contract. He kept the money. Pretty clever, but it doesn't take a genius to see that everyone who signed was a total idiot. I only read this very shortly after that date though, so I don't remember everything 100%. I think about this church all the time. My 21st birthday was that date, and we all said we had to party like it was the end of the world. I just googled the main guy the other month to see what happened. I couldn't work out what the church is up to now, what happened after the world didn't end. What has your church done? If I recall correctly, Harold Camping, the dude who was in charge, said they had miscalculated and the actual date was October 21st. When October 21st came and went, the radio church denounced him as a false prophet and apologized for everything. However, before his October prediction came and went on June 9th, he had a minor stroke. The stroke didn't affect his motor functions that badly. Except, it messed up his ability to speak properly for the rest of his life. This guy was a radio personality and lost his goddamn ability to speak, and nothing else. And that's why I'm agnostic. I'm all, there's no magic man in the sky, but part of me thinks that someone up there really wanted him to shut the hell up. Also, fun fact, May 20th was the night Randy Macho Man Savage passed away. My brother and I joke that he suplexed the Rapture and saved humanity at the cost of his own life. The hero we truly deserve. I remember that day. I worked in a restaurant and a bunch of those people came in. They were dazed and obviously not in a good way. And they were some of the most inconsiderate people I've ever dealt with. It was a small and very busy restaurant. They just kept coming and switching tables and rearranging tables. The hostess politely set them up with a bigger spot and asked if that was all of them, but they kept coming. She then had to play goalie at the door and had to keep them from crowding that table. Most of them ordered little to nothing. As far as I recall, they tipped okay, but it wasn't worth the hassle. Story 3. My aunt, uncle, and their 5-ish kids were in a cult in the 80s and 90s. They were faith healers, and the leader basically preached that if you got sick, it was because you didn't love God enough. Their oh crap moment was when the cult leader died of gangrene. They immediately founded their own church after the cult disbanded though, so they definitely still have some weird beliefs. Oh geez, I feel like a hood was just pulled from over my head. When I was about 13, I got diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. For the unaware, it's a chronic degenerative autoimmune disease in which your immune system mistakes joint tissue for a pathogen. My family was pretty religious in the typical Appalachian Protestant kind of way. We went to a church in what most would call nowhere. It was non-denominational, which is to say the 50-some-odd members of the congregation had shopped around before finding a church that fit their ideology. Part of this was faith healing. Set the scene, I was in middle school, I walked with a pronounced limp, and while I was bored by church, who isn't? I was what grandparents would have called a good Christian boy. The pastor called for a lay-on-hand prayer for me after a sermon of music and sinners in the hands of an angry God. A religious person would say, you could feel the spirit moving. Everyone was pumped and couldn't wait to get their hand on me so they could pray. It lasted a couple of minutes. About 20 people piled onto me on the altar and put their open palms somewhere on my chest or arm. A dab of baby oil was put on my forehead and everyone said an individual prayer out loud at once. It was an unintelligible cacophony of praise Jesus. Then it stopped. Everyone pulled back and gave me a pat on the back, expecting what they thought was the obvious, which obviously didn't happen. I made for my pew, not wanting to disappoint, and very much wanting to get out of the scrutiny of the deacons. "Show us you're healed!" I hear someone call from cupped hands in the back. I felt like my heart fell into my stomach. It felt like an eternity passed in a few seconds. What should I do? I can't say it didn't work. That would spit in their faces. After suppressing a panic attack with a skill usually reserved for English, I did the only thing my child's mind thought appropriate. I did a quick, lame, queer little half jump. One of my feet didn't even leave the floor. The church was dead silent. It was like someone had just told them that the earth was flat. Someone finally clapped, but I knew. I took my seat and bore the weight of disappointment until we left. It was the most embarrassed I've ever been, and was the start of me losing my religion. A lot more happened in that church that of course seemed creepy in hindsight. Reminds me of something I saw on Instagram today. This woman and her family live in Hawaii, and recently one of her sons became ill. She tried using all natural remedies and such, but he kept getting worse. So they went to the doctor and he has pneumonia, so now he's on antibiotics. The story should pretty much end there, but because her whole identity is founded on an all-natural organic philosophy of living, antibiotics don't really fit into that. So she wrote a post basically wringing her hands, explaining the decision she made to her thousands of followers. Most people, being reasonable, were saying, well, you tried the first way you thought was best, and when it didn't work, you took him to a doctor. Antibiotics are fine if they aren't abused, but some people were being silly. And one person in particular suggested that he got sick because of a sickness in his soul. She said that spiritual pneumonia could be caused by being weak of character, being indecisive and being afraid to make changes. So stupid. I wrote her a reply, and now I'm just anticipating an angry response either from her or someone else. This is absolutely stupid. I've posted this before, it's something the pastor at my old church used to say. A man was hit by a car while walking across the road. An ambulance stops and asks if he needs help. He says, "No, God will save me." Some minutes go by and another ambulance stops and asks again if he needs help. Again, he says no. This continues until the man dies. When he reaches heaven, he asks God why he didn't help him. God tells him that he tried. That's what all the ambulances were for. Story 4. There really wasn't one concrete oh crap moment, but the first time I remember thinking this is BS was how often people would be sentenced to hell for the most trivial reasons. Everything from impure thoughts to cursing to sleeping in late. So one day I was discussing future marriage with my mother, as all 11-year-olds in the sect do, and the topic of what I would do if my husband potentially abused me came up, having witnessed frequent mistreatment and power play relationships by that point. Me. Then divorce is okay, right? Her. No, divorce is never okay. Me. But what about if he beat me really, really badly, and I was hurt with bruises? Her. It's still not okay. Me. Well then, what do I do? Her. You pray for him and ask the Lord to help him see the error of his ways. The Lord can always work, and it's blasphemy to try to interfere with his plans by divorcing. That's when I remember thinking, BS. What the hell? Sometimes I question really religious people. I grew up Catholic, and my parents tell me divorce isn't what one should do, but they have told me, and my sister specifically, if there's any abuse or any type of irresponsibility from your significant other, getting out of that divorce is fine as long as you are happy and safe. Yep, that was the reaction of my parents when I told them I wanted to divorce my husband for pushing me down a set of concrete stairs and landing me in the hospital for a week, then telling my family I was traveling so they wouldn't find out. I divorced him anyway. The world, to their surprise, did not stop turning. Story 5. I knew a guy born into a fundamentalist Mormon sect on the Montana/Idaho border. His oh crap moment was his 18th birthday when his dad and the men kicked him out of town and told him to never come back. They keep the girls and marry them off to other men in town, but boys gotta go so they don't take the precious girls. Reminds me of the Book of the Unnamed Midwife, where the old church leader sends all of the younger adult Mormon men off on missions, even though most of the US has been destroyed by the plague, because they want them to die or at least be separated, so the old creepy leaders can hoard all the women. I read the book Escape by Carolyn Jessup. She was born into the fundamentalist Church of the Latter-day Saints. Amazing story about her escape from the cult and how difficult it was when even the police in town were FLDS. Even after leaving, the courts allowed her ex-husband visitation rights to their children, which continued the indoctrination she was trying to escape from. Highly recommended read. Story 6. The pastors got involved in the prepping movement. Suddenly, there was this huge focus on the end times. One day, she started tearing into me about not stockpiling more food. The pastors had joined an MLM scam for dried food. Most of the members were dirt poor, but suddenly God wanted us all to buy expensive prepper stuff. My pastor had a very strong anti-MLM stance, and this was before it really got big via social networks. He actually kicked people out of the church for marketing in their congregation after being told that it wasn't cool there. The guy went bonkers with the end time stuff, but he was a good person overall and just got confused. I had a confusing call with a relative about that once. She told me that I needed to have stockpiles of food. I replied that I already did since I was living in an earthquake-prone area. Cue her confusion. I was doing it wrong. I was supposed to be stockpiling because of the coming economic collapse and race wars, not earthquakes. Then she started drifting about, as she knew I was doing things wrong but could not actually come up with an action for me to take to fix it. Sane prepping shouldn't be all that expensive. Probably something beyond what a poor person could afford, and I guess if you're trying to prepare for the end of the world, it's different. But I keep enough backup food and water at home to be able to last 2 to 4 weeks with everything shut down. Not for like the apocalypse or societal breakdown or something, but in case there's an ice storm and the roads are unsafe for a while, or a gas shortage makes it impossible to get to the store very easily, or some disaster requires me to evacuate on short notice. Part of the preps is that it's all in convenient containers along with a few extra outfits and stuff so we can just toss them all into the car and go. Gathering all of this and rotating the food is really just like buying a few extra things at the grocery store each time and one trip to buy all the plastic totes to keep it in. And if you don't camp a lot, so that you already own one, buying a water filter. But then you can't just get rich trying to sell that to people, saying, hey, keep some boxes of canned food and some water and a water filter and a bag of clothes in your basement so that you can weather most disasters or leave in a hurry, doesn't whip people into a spending frenzy as much as telling people they need to prepare for end times by buying all of this crap that they don't sell at most stores. Story 7. My brother and I grew up in a cult family, not specifically naming anything, but has since disbanded to my knowledge, though some of y'all might know which town this happened in. Picture this, a rural town in the middle of nowhere with only a handful of people. It was made very clear that outsiders weren't welcome and we obviously didn't get many guests. The ones that stumbled upon us were lost. The town looked creepy as hell, so they cleared out fast. Contact with the rest of the world was non-existent, and we didn't have access to anything, no news, TV, etc. Here are some of the worst things that are burned into my memory. Live animal sacrifices were common. On special occasions, leaders cut them open and followers were required to eat a piece of the heart. One time, I threw up after the ceremony and was beaten. People got sick frequently but weren't permitted to see a medical professional outside of the cult, but the doctors in the cult were absolute quacks. Education was handled by leaders and whoever they appointed. My older brother really liked dragonflies and other insects. Our dad would capture them and force them to pluck the wings off as a sacrifice. It was typical for the members to be bed with each other. Consensual or not, leaders and their favorites were allowed to rape. My brother and I knew our real parents, but we were taught to treat every adult as a parent. They turned a blind eye to the molestation of children. They would marry us teens and kids off informally to people within the cult. When I say informally, I mean there was no government or legal work to back it up. We were just told that we would be marrying this person and didn't have a choice. I had a romantic and semi-sexual relationship with a teenage boy in the cult. I was slightly younger than him at the time. I became overly paranoid because it was against our religion to be engaging in same-sex relations. For a long time, I thought I was going to die since he disappeared one day with no warning. I still have no idea what happened, if he got out by ditching in the middle of the night like I did, or if he was killed. I don't know what happened to my parents, but they're probably dead. I haven't seen my brother since that day. I have no way of contacting him if he's alive, and I don't even know where he'd be. I did enlist in the army, and the recruiter who got me in, the friend previously mentioned, worked his ass off helping me get legal documentation. I gave him all the personal information I knew. We reached out to hospitals in the state, and eventually a document with my last name and parents popped up. I was fortunate enough to be in a state that only needed a statement that said that you were that person in order to get a birth certificate. The recruiter also helped me obtain a student ID so I could get the other documentation I needed, social security card, etc. Note, it wasn't an immediate transition from cult to military, though I understand why some of you might have thought that. What happened after you ran away? Where did you go? Was the outside world what you expected? I didn't look back. The night I left, I kept going until I found a paved road, was picked up by a young man and can still picture his pickup clear as day. I told him I ran away from home but nothing else, and he didn't pry, so we just kept driving. He made small talk and I mostly listened, but eventually I confessed I didn't have any plan or place to go. He suggested the military service. He had a friend in it who could help me, plus they'd get me on my feet. I enlisted. It was like being 5 years old again for many years. I had to relearn a lot because what I had been told in my childhood was centered around the cult's beliefs, and my education was severely lacking for my age. I was considered an 18-year-old in 5th grade. My time was spent drifting between homes and jobs and friends, never staying in one spot for too long. I didn't feel connected to any identity since it wasn't like I had papers to say who I was. To avoid questions and make myself feel better, I created a story about my childhood, how my family all died in a car crash when I was little. And I said I didn't like talking about them so people didn't ask. I had a job as a mover for a while, and that's where I met my long-term boyfriend. Currently I live with him and just try to take things one day at a time. Sorry, I wish I could answer this better. Story 8. When I was 19, and by orders of the pastor, my mom took my bedroom door off the hinges. They were doing everything in their power for me not to leave the church. She would do random searches and pat-downs to see if I had any communication with the outside world. There were so many signs that I started seeing when I got older. I was raised in the religion, but I was terrified to leave due to the shunning, the fear, and being ashamed of leaving the truth. Also, my mom didn't want me to go to a therapist even after knowing I was having panic attacks because she was afraid that the therapist would take the fear of God out of my life. Ex-Jehovah's Witness here too, taking the door off your room. Whoa, that got real. The shunning from your friends and family is the most difficult. I was born into the religion but left as soon as I could at 18 when I moved away from home. For me, it was several things. For one, I could never come to terms with scientific fossil evidence, dinosaurs, Neanderthal, etc., given that JWs taught back then that the Earth was only around 6,000 years old. Then, my sister was disfellowshipped for having an affair with her husband. His father was an elder. Watching our friends turn their back on her killed me, and kicked off my inner rebellion against them. I was around 14 then. My brother was then shunned for coming out of the closet and admitting he was gay. That just sealed the deal for me when I was 16. That's one of the things that makes a religion a cult in my eyes, trying to take away people's freedom of choice. If they're claiming to take the Bible seriously, one of the very first gifts God gave people was freedom of choice. Even when they mess up big time, he keeps saying, "Come on guys, make better choices. These ones have awful consequences," but doesn't take the ability to choose away. How can they justify doing something so contrary to the basic nature of how God wants to relate to people? The choice is fundamental. Anything else is evil. Story 9. Had a very intelligent friend. She also grew up in this cult. I remember her telling me one day how much she was struggling in science class because evolution made sense to her, but she knew it conflicted with her faith. She was in tears over it, saying that she needed to block it out. Yeah, that sucks. One of my neighbors and I were talking about religion a few weeks ago, and he says, "I don't really care what anyone believes, as long as they're not one of those morons who think we came from monkeys." So I kinda laughed it off, but he was dead freaking serious. I'm like, dude, we absolutely did come from monkeys. And he seriously got angry and was like, "Oh, here we go. If we came from monkeys, then how come there are still freaking monkeys?" I was just in awe at how someone could actually deny evolution in the modern day. I just kinda dropped the subject after that. Story 10. One of my best friends today was raised in a freaking Afro-Islamic cult. He and his mom left when his dad was sent on a mission to Sudan. As it turned out, he was sent to fight in a civil war on behalf of the local tribe/cult. They never heard from him ever again. They assume he was killed in action. He described his childhood as animal sacrifices, usually goats every Friday, and he was forced to eat the heart raw and drink the blood, or else he would be beaten. The cult owned a house-turned-apartment building in Detroit where he lived, and said that his mother was never permitted to leave the building. He described how female genital mutilation was mandatory for all girls, which is especially messed up. Crazy to think that these kinds of things are happening in the United States. When he was 8, he and his mom managed to escape the cult by stealing thousands of dollars in cash, fled in the middle of the night, and paid a truck driver to smuggle them into Canada. They stayed in the country illegally for a month, slowly making their way from Ontario to British Columbia, where they smuggled themselves back across the border into Washington. There, they got support from a mosque, set his mom up with a place to live and a job at a restaurant, and helped get my friend back into the school system and back into society. For years, they were paranoid as hell because they thought that the cult was going to hunt them down and kill them, but being dressed head to toe in a burqa has its advantages, I guess. She was able to hustle at the job, and through financial support from the mosque, he was able to attend college, where we met. He's working at a bank now and doing really well for himself. He's getting married soon, and he's fully supporting his mother as well. Story 11. When I read a book about our sect that told its actual history, even though the leaders always said it was created in the time of Jesus and passed down over the millennia in the same form. If people believe all this Simpsons predicted X BS, it makes sense to me that people in a cult would think that people in biblical times would just know how their cult was going to form. Fun fact, there was an episode of Doctor Who about this. The Doctor ends up in a world, a complex society, but he thinks something's off. He confides in one of the more intelligent men who admits that he too has noticed something horrifyingly wrong. The books are old, but they chronicle the rise of Castrovalva up to the present day. A Southern Baptist pastor's wife recommended to her husband that I teach the church's youth group about the history of their church because my mother blabbed my love of learning about religious history. I respectfully declined, knowing full well that the version I read from history books would conflict with the pastor's version of history and be deemed a fabrication by Satanists who want to lead the faithful to hell. This same pastor believes that the Harry Potter books are Satan's way of turning kids into witches, and Trump is a true Christian man. Story 12. It was a Sunday. Sundays we'd usually go during the day and afternoon. But after the first part, when my parents sat me down, they told me that they were leaving. I recall being sad because I was playing a game with my friends. At the time, I was confused. My friends that I grew up with ignored me like I didn't exist. I felt like everything I knew was gone. Later on, I slowly pieced together what went on there was not normal. I noticed the manipulative tactics, such as showing us graphic videos of people dying and being ripped up because they didn't follow God. They told us that if we didn't ask the pastor for permission in relationships, we'd end up being abused. They made us have no TV to isolate us, but there's more. But it was very difficult to leave. It felt like my entire life was a lie and everything I had learned for 12 years was taken away, and I was left clueless as ever and couldn't relate to anyone. Story 13. I was at a yearly conference at a megachurch in my state when I was 15. There were fog machines and laser lights during worship, and the power mysteriously went out as we took communion, which was an obvious indication that God was in our favor instead of just an overloaded circuit of someone pulling the plug. That's around the time I realized that you can trick anyone into believing anything and started doing research. Officially denounced the church when I was 17 and had seen enough. Story 14. I don't think I ever truly believed, but the moment that was cemented for me was when I had the unfortunate experience of going on a mission trip to Cambodia. Long story short, 2 teams from the church I had previously attended were sent. For the first 2 weeks, the teams were sent to different locations. During this time, we helped the local communities, and it was actually pretty nice with normal prayer sessions, etc., etc. However, during the last couple days of the trip, both teams met up and stayed in the same location. It was then that stories from the other team about being possessed by the devil, spiritual enlightenment, tongues, becoming a vessel for God to speak through, and being struck down by the love of God were mentioned by the other team. Keep in mind, till that point our team just had your good old regular fashion prayer sessions. Surprise, surprise, later that night when both teams held a joint prayer session, members from my team started hysterically yelling, crying out for God, and passing out on the ground. It was at that moment when I realized that it was all BS and pretty much mass hysteria mixed in with an enlightenment dick-measuring contest. I grew up in a church like this. The mass speaking in tongues, prayers that knocked people over, it was so dramatic, but being the person I am, I wanted some backing. The most I got was, no, it doesn't say this in the Bible, but you have to interpret what the Bible means. So I had to figure out what wasn't written in the Bible. So I started reading and found out that what they were doing was pulling a little from here and a little from there and stitching together their own text. I left after high school and eventually wound up at a church that is Bible-centered and not centered around drama and theatrics. I wouldn't call the church I grew up in a cult, but the hysteria aspect and context resonate with me. It's the same conclusion I came to eventually after years of thinking that I didn't believe or pray enough. Today, I see some of the things that people I respect believe and say on Facebook, and it stuns me. They have moved so far away from the things they taught me. Good things about love, equality, and peace. It is heartbreaking. Story 15. My mother and I had a conversation about how cute babies are, and she mentioned that the sweet, innocent, lovable nature of infants makes a mother forget the nearly lethal experience of labor. She kissed my cheek and called me Angel. I asked her why then was I born if my elder brother's birth was so terrifying and painful for her. Deuteronomy 5:16 roughly says that children who honor their father and mother as God says, therefore honoring God too, will be blessed, and the parents are therefore blessed by having a respectful child. In the cult, job descriptions and qualifications include scriptures. My father wanted a job, and one of the requirements was that his children respect him and fear the Lord, but he only had one child at the time. He was told he would not get the promotion until he had another child, and my mother was accosted several times, being told she was selfish, a hellish woman, worse than Eve, and that her vagina was a hole to hell. That is not an exaggeration. It was a common insult in the cult. along with calling others uncircumcised and haughty because people in cults speak with marked peculiarity. She had several panic attacks and finally stuck off to find a psychiatrist and renew her use of the anxiety medication that she was on before my father made her stop taking them. Once I was conceived, my father was promoted and they were transferred to what was at the time the USSR. My brother was left with, honestly, I don't know who, and my parents won't tell me, but they left for the remainder of her pregnancy. Against medical advice, they flew back to the US and I was born in Illinois. For the next 5 years, we were left with strangers who were ranked highly enough in the cult to take care of the children of my father's ranking until we were assigned secondary parents. Give about 13 years and I had a secret and god-awful boyfriend who did not understand consent, but then again neither did I. Well, one day I walked home after a rough date, and upon going to the bathroom I found blood, and realized it was nowhere near my period time. I told my mother and she said that is what happens with men, and went to her room. The next Friday I felt so disgusting that I wanted to purge myself, die to myself, and give my life to the cult. So I confessed everything about how impure I was to the female leaders. One told me I know nothing of pain and because of my father's ranking I lie for attention. The other said she would not trust me to hold her own child. Which is very insulting to say this to any female who has menstruated, as it is your primary function in the cult, to care for your own and other children. It is worse than telling someone that their very existence is inherently meaningless, and the third said my presence was detrimental to the souls of those around me, so I am to leave and not return, and since I am a liar of anyone fully in the cult, ask me what happened to lie or they will say I am a whore and a liar. I missed the next 3 periods until one day I was sitting in our living room in an expensive house in Southern California paid by the forced tithe of those who could barely feed their own children, and I started to bleed. A lot. And then vomit. And then I could barely crawl. So I lay in the bathroom until it was over. I thought I was going to die, and I was happy about it. I woke up in the bathroom, cleaned up, and went to school. My secondary sister snuck my pain meds from the medicine cabinet. Father is prone to migraines. I told my parents what happened that Thursday. My mother started crying, but my father stopped her. She said that right after she had my brother, she conceived again, twins, but she lost them, bled them out like a curse. My father told her that she had killed the wrong child, and they left me to process it. I didn't have any tears or anger, just sort of a sharp clarity that hadn't left me since. They later told me they were proud of me because I didn't cry, but needed time to process the death of the wrong daughter. Thanks for watching until the end. If you have a similar story to these that you feel comfortable sharing with us, please leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.